She didn't just spill wine. She poured it slowly. On purpose. Right in front of 400 guests. Crystal glasses froze midair. The orchestra stopped playing. The bride smiled, chin lifted, as red wine soaked into the waitress's uniform. "Maybe skip dessert next time," she said softly, "but it seems you don't skip anything." Laughter. Phones came out. The waitress stood there, frozen, breathing heavy, feeling every pair of eyes on her body. Then the Mafia Boss looked at his bride. Not at her dress, not at her face. At her. And for the first time that night, he removed his ring. 12 hours later, she wasn't a bride anymore. She was a headline. Before we proceed, don't forget to subscribe in order not to miss new stories. The air in the Grand Vein ballroom didn't just smell of expensive lilies and aged bourbon. It smelled of undisputed power. Crystal chandeliers dripped from the gilded ceilings like frozen rain, casting a jagged glow over the sea of guests draped in silk and arrogance. At the center of this engineered perfection stood Portia Sterling. In her ivory lace and a diamond tiara that could buy a small country, she wasn't just a bride, she was a general inspecting her troops. Every floral arrangement had to be angled to the millimeter. Every server had to move like a ghost. Among the staff, Nomi Solange moved with a quiet, practiced grace that defied the chaos. She was a woman of soft curves and steady hands, her presence a calm harbor in the storm of Portia's frantic demands. Despite the frantic pace of the gala, Nomi remained professional, her black uniform pressed and her expression neutral. She knew her place in this world. She was the invisible machinery that made the elite look effortless. Portia, however, saw her. Every time Nomi walked past, Portia's eyes narrowed. It wasn't just the stress of the wedding, it was the way Nomi carried herself, with a dignity that Portia, for all her riches, couldn't seem to manufacture. The bride's insecurity flickered behind her heavy mascara, a jagged edge disguised by a sharp, painted smile. The breaking point arrived with a bottle of vintage Bordeaux. As Nomi leaned in to refresh Portia's glass, the bride shifted her arm abruptly, catching Nomi's elbow. A few dark drops splashed onto the pristine white tablecloth. The room went silent. "Careful," Portia shrieked, her voice cutting through the soft string quartet like a blade. She didn't look at the spill, she looked at Nomi. "God, look at you. No wonder you're so clumsy. Is the uniform even legal, or did they have to use two to cover all that? Extra." Nomi froze, the silver tray trembling slightly in her hand. She didn't look down. She didn't cry. She kept her eyes fixed just past Portia's shoulder. "I apologize, Miss Sterling. I will have the cloth changed immediately." "Don't bother," Portia laughed, a high, brittle sound that invited the nearby socialites to join in. A few did, their snickers rippling through the front row of the ballroom. "Maybe if you spent less time at the buffet and more time learning how to balance your own weight, you wouldn't be such an eyesore at my wedding. You're dragging down the aesthetic of the entire room." Nomi felt the heat crawl up her neck, the weight of 100 judgmental eyes pressing against her skin. She realized then that the bump hadn't been an accident. Portia's smirk was too wide, too triumphant. The humiliation wasn't accidental. It was calculated. The silence that followed Portia's laughter didn't just fill the room, it suffocated it. Nomi Solange stood perfectly still, her heart hammering a frantic, uneven rhythm against her ribs. She could feel the heat of the vintage Bordeaux as it seeped through her white apron, the damp fabric clinging to her skin like a cold brand of shame. Inhale, exhale. She focused on the slow, rhythmic drip-drop of the wine falling from the edge of the silver tray onto the polished marble floor. Each crimson bead was a countdown, marking the seconds she remained a spectacle for the wealthiest elite in the city. Her vision blurred at the edges, the glittering chandeliers turning into jagged smears of light, but she refused to let a single tear fall. To cry was to give Portia the satisfaction she was so clearly craving. Portia leaned back, her hand resting delicately on the table, her diamond engagement ring catching the light. She looked like a predator who had just finished a successful hunt. The smirk on her face wasn't just superior, it was gluttonous. She drank in Nomi's stillness, feeding on the girl's forced composure. Around them, the guests hovered in a state of predatory curiosity, their champagne glasses frozen halfway to their lips. They weren't horrified, they were entertained. Then, the air in the room shifted. It wasn't a sound, but a change in pressure. At the head of the table, Lucian Vane sat like a statue carved from obsidian. His large, scarred hand remained wrapped around his crystal tumbler, the amber liquid inside perfectly still. He didn't jump to his feet. He didn't offer a chivalrous handkerchief or a sharp rebuke to his bride-to-be. He simply watched. His dark eyes, usually unreadable and cold, were fixed entirely on Nomi. He traced the line of the wine stain on her uniform, then moved his gaze slowly up to her face, nodding the way her jaw was clamped shut to prevent it from trembling. The guests began to murmur, the whispers snaking through the crowd like a fuse. Everyone was waiting. They expected him to laugh with Portia, or perhaps to dismiss the clumsy staff member with a flick of his wrist. Portia's smile faltered for a fraction of a second as she glanced toward her fiancé, seeking his validation, his shared cruelty. But Lucian didn't give it. He didn't blink. He sat in the center of the storm he had helped create, his presence a heavy, looming shadow that seemed to draw the very light out of the room. He didn't shout, he didn't move, he just watched. The stillness in the ballroom had become a physical weight, a vacuum that sucked the oxygen from the lungs of every socialite and guard in the room. Lucian Vane finally moved, but it wasn't the explosive outburst the crowd had braced for. It was a slow, deliberate uncoiling of a predator. His large, scarred hand reached up to his left ring finger. With a chillingly steady grip, he began to slide the heavy gold band upward. The metal caught the light of the chandeliers, a flash of promise and power that was suddenly being retracted. The sound of the ring sliding against his skin was the only noise in the cavernous room, more deafening than a gunshot. He didn't look at Nomi, and he didn't look at the wine-stained carpet. He looked directly at his best man, who stood rigid 2 steps behind him. Lucian extended his hand, the ring resting in the center of his palm like a spent shell casing. "Take this," Lucian said. His voice was a low, velvet rasp, calm, conversational, and utterly devoid of heat, "and call it off." The words didn't seem to register at first. They hovered in the air, too heavy to be real. The string quartet, sensing the catastrophic shift in the room's orbit, faltered. One by one, the violins went silent until the only sound was the distant hum of the air conditioning and the frantic, shallow breathing of the guests. Portia's sharp, painted face froze for a heartbeat before a high-pitched, brittle laugh escaped her throat. It was the sound of a woman who was certain she had misheard, or perhaps the sound of a woman who believed she was the only one in on the joke. "Lucian, darling, really?" she chirped, her hand fluttering toward his arm, her eyes wide with a performative sparkle. "You have such a dry sense of humor. You're scaring the guests over a little spill. I know I was a bit firm with the help, but we have a schedule to keep. The priest is already in the foyer." She looked around the room, inviting the elite to join her in the absurdity of the moment. Can you imagine canceling a Sterling Vane union over a clumsy waitress? Lucian finally turned his head. He didn't flinch as she touched him, but he didn't lean in either. He looked at Portia as if she were a specimen under glass, something fascinating, flawed, and ultimately disposable. Portia's smile began to wither at the edges. Her hand dropped from his sleeve, her fingers curling into a tight, trembling fist. The silence stretched, agonizing and thick, as she searched his face for a wink, a smirk, or even a flash of anger she could manipulate. She found nothing but a vast, icy emptiness. He wasn't smiling. The atmosphere in the Grand Vane ballroom didn't just cool, it solidified into a wall of ice. Portia Sterling stood at the center of it, her chest heaving beneath the weight of her lace bodice, her eyes darting from face to face. She looked for a sympathetic glance, a shared roll of the eyes, or a whispered joke to break the tension. But there was nothing. One by one, the guests, the very people who had snickered at her cruel jokes moments ago, began to take a collective step back. It was a slow, rhythmic retreat, like a tide pulling away from a shipwreck. There was no collective gasp, no frantic whispering, no rush to defend the honor of a Sterling. There was only the sound of silk rustling and the soft scuff of leather soles on marble as the elite created a vacuum of space around the woman who was no longer a future Vane. The distance was surgical. In the high-stakes world of Lucian Vane, loyalty was a currency, and Portia's account had just been closed. To stand near her now was to risk being caught in the fallout of her social execution. The powerful men and women who had traveled across the globe for this union suddenly found deep interest in the architecture of the ceiling or the depths of their half-empty glasses. They weren't just watching a wedding fall apart, they were watching a predator become prey. In the middle of the growing void, Nomi Salange remained anchored to her spot. The wine was still dripping, a steady, rhythmic tap-tap-tap against the floor that seemed to mark the seconds of Portia's reign ending. Nomi's uniform was ruined, her skin was stained, and her dignity had been dragged through the dirt, yet she was the only one in the room who didn't move. She was the ghost at the feast, the silent witness to a collapse she hadn't asked for but had inadvertently triggered. Portia's gaze finally snapped back to Lucian, then to the crowd, and finally to Nomi. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. The aesthetic she had spent a lifetime perfecting had shattered. The weight she had mocked was no longer the focus. It was the crushing weight of the silence that now defined her. The diamonds in her tiara felt like lead, and the grand ballroom felt like a cage. She had spent years making others feel invisible, building her stature on the backs of those she deemed lesser. But as she stood in the center of a room full of people who refused to even acknowledge her existence, the truth settled in her bones. For the first time in her life, she felt small. The heavy silence in the ballroom wasn't broken by a roar, but by the quiet, measured sound of Lucian Vane's footsteps. He bypassed the weeping Portia as if she were a piece of broken furniture, stopping only when he stood directly in front of Nomi. The height difference was staggering, his shadow swallowing her whole, but his eyes held none of the jagged ice that had just frozen the room. "My mother was a laundress," Lucian began, his voice barely above a whisper, yet it carried to the furthest corners of the silent hall. He wasn't looking at the crowd, he was looking at the wine stain on Nomi's apron. She spent 20 years scrubbing the filth out of clothes belonging to people who didn't know her name. Once, at a gala not unlike this one, a woman tripped and spilled a glass of champagne on her. That woman didn't apologize. She called my mother a clumsy, bloated cow in front of 300 people. A ripple of unease passed through the guests. The myth of Lucian Vane was one of silver spoons and ancient bloodlines, a lie he had allowed the world to believe to protect his climb. But the man standing there now, his jaw tight and his gaze hauntingly human, was shedding that skin. "I grew up in the shadow of that humiliation," he continued, his voice hardening like cooling steel. "I was the boy in the oversized hand-me-downs, the one the neighborhood kids used for target practice because I was too slow, too soft, too much of a target. I built this empire brick by brick so that no one would ever have the power to look down on me again. I fought my way out of the dirt to ensure that names like Vane meant something more than just a bank account." He finally turned his head toward Portia. She looked small, her expensive lace suddenly looking like a cheap costume. "I spent my entire life running away from the ghosts of bullies," Lucian said, his words sharp enough to draw blood. "And I almost invited one into my home. I looked at you and saw a partner. Today, I looked at you and saw the woman who made my mother cry. I saw the children who pushed me into the mud because they thought my size made me less than human." He took a final step toward Nomi, his hand reaching out, not to dismiss her, but to gently take the trembling silver tray from her grip. He set it on a nearby table with a definitive clink. "I can forgive mistakes, Nomi," he said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate frequency. "But I don't forgive cruelty." The revelation hung in the air, a heavy, soulful weight that shifted the entire foundation of the evening. Lucian Vane hadn't just canceled a wedding. He had declared war on the very arrogance that built the room. The tension in the room thickened as Lucian remained standing before Nomi, his presence a shield against the hundreds of staring eyes. He reached into his breast pocket and produced a silk handkerchief, dark as midnight, and held it out to her. Nomi hesitated, her fingers hovering near the fine fabric, her mind reeling from the confession he had just shared with the entire room. "You don't remember me, do you, Nomi?" Lucian asked. The question was soft, almost private, creating an invisible wall between them and the ruins of his engagement. Nomi shook her head slowly, her voice a mere breath. I've served many people, Mr. Vane, I'm sorry. 3 years ago, Lucian said, a ghost of a smile touching the corner of his mouth, the first sign of warmth anyone had seen from him in years. A small bistro on the edge of the docks. A young girl, barely 18, had spilled a tray of crystal glasses. The manager was screaming, ready to fire her on the spot in front of a line of tourists. You were off the clock, heading for the door with your coat on, but you stopped. You told the manager it was your fault. You handed him your week's tips to cover the breakage, and stayed 2 extra hours to scrub the floor so that girl could go home and cry in peace. Nomi's eyes widened as the memory surfaced. The terrified girl, the shattering glass, and the cold, rainy night she had sacrificed to save a stranger's job. That was your sister. That was Mia, Lucian confirmed, his voice vibrating with a sudden, fierce pride. She came home and told me about the woman who was like an angel in a grease-stained apron. I spent months trying to find you to thank you, but you had already moved on. I didn't know your name until I saw it on the staff roster tonight. I recognized your eyes the moment you poured my first drink. He turned back to Portia, who was trembling, her face a mask of smudged mascara and crumbling pride. She looked at Nomi, then at the man she had lost, realization dawning too late that the woman she had targeted wasn't a random victim. She had been the only person in the world Lucian Vane felt he owed a debt to. Lucian stepped closer to his former bride, his shadow looming over her like a final judgment. He didn't need to raise his voice. The truth was loud enough to shatter whatever remained of her status. You thought you were picking on a nobody, Lucian said, his tone dripping with a cold, lethal irony. You thought you were displaying your power by crushing someone you deemed beneath you, but you didn't just insult a waitress, Portia. He looked back at Nomi, his gaze promising a protection she had never known. You humiliated the wrong woman. Portia's composure didn't just break, it dissolved into a frantic, ugly desperation. She lunged forward, her fingers clawing at Lucian's sleeve, her movements jarring and desperate against the stillness of his tailored suit. The diamond tiara slipped, tilting precariously over one eye, but she didn't seem to notice. The general had become a beggar. Lucian, please, you're overreacting, she gasped, her voice climbing into a shrill, unstable register. It was the champagne. I haven't eaten all day, the stress of the wedding, the planning. I wasn't myself. I was just nervous. Everyone was looking at me, and I felt so much pressure to be perfect. Lucian didn't pull away, but his arm remained as rigid as marble. He looked down at her hand as if it were a stray piece of lint. And the guests, Portia continued, her eyes darting toward the crowd, looking for a scapegoat among the frozen elite. They were laughing. I thought it was what they wanted. I was trying to keep the mood light. It was a joke, Lucian, a poor one, fine, but a joke. You can't throw away our family's futures because of a few words spoken in heat. She turned toward Nomi, her face contorting into a mask of hollow repentance. I'm sorry, okay? Is that what you want? I'll pay for the uniform. I'll double your salary. I'll buy you a whole new wardrobe. Just tell him it's fine. Tell him I didn't mean it. Nomi didn't answer. She didn't have to. The air in the room was thick with the stench of Portia's sudden, shallow kindness, a brand of mercy that only appeared when there was a price tag attached to the consequences. Lucian finally spoke, his voice so quiet it forced Portia to stop her frantic rambling just to hear him. It was a low, devastating rumble that silenced the last of her excuses. You aren't sorry you hurt her, Portia, he said, his eyes boring into hers with a clarity that stripped her soul bare. You are only sorry that I saw it. You blame the wine, you blame the guests, you blame the pressure. You blame everything but the heart that allowed those words to leave your mouth. He gently but firmly uncurled her fingers from his arm. The rejection was absolute. You told me earlier that she was an eyesore who dragged down the aesthetic of the room, Lucian said, his gaze shifting briefly to Nomi with an unmistakable spark of protection. But the only thing ugly in this ballroom is the woman standing in that white dress. Portia sobbed, a harsh, choking sound, but Lucian was already turning away. Don't lie to me anymore, he whispered. You didn't make a mistake. You showed me exactly who you are. The silence that followed Portia's collapse was absolute, a heavy shroud that smothered the sobbing woman at the center of the floor. Lucian didn't look back at her. Instead, he reached out, his hand open and steady, and waited for Nomi to take it. After a heartbeat of hesitation, she placed her hand in his. His skin was warm, a stark contrast to the icy judgment that had gripped the room. With a gentle but firm tug, Lucian led Nomi toward the head table. The guests parted like a retreating sea, their eyes wide as they watched the blood-stained uniform of a waitress move toward the seat reserved for the most powerful woman in the city. Lucian pulled out the heavy, velvet-cushioned chair, the one positioned directly beside his own. He waited until Nomi sat, her posture straight despite the wine still dampening her shoulder. She sat with a quiet, unshakable poise that no amount of lace or diamonds could have bought. Portia, still trembling on the outskirts of the light, watched in horror. That's my seat," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Lucian, you're letting a servant sit at the head of the vein table." Lucian leaned forward, his hands gripping the back of Nomi's chair. He looked out at the assembly of the wealthy and the cruel, his gaze a warning and a promise. "Tonight, this room was meant to celebrate a union of power," Lucian's voice rang out, vibrating with a lethal clarity. "But I have realized that power without character is nothing more than a well-dressed void. You all watched as a woman was humiliated for your amusement. You mistook her silence for weakness and her status for insignificance." He looked down at Nomi, who met his gaze with a resilience that finally made the powerful man smile, a small, private thing. He turned his head back to the crowd, his voice dropping to a gravelly, unforgettable tone that would be whispered about in every boardroom for years to come. "I am not replacing a bride today," he declared. "I am correcting a mistake. This woman has more honor in her stained apron than anyone else in this hall has in their silk. Let this be the lesson you take home with you." He let the words hang in the air, the final gavel stroke on Portia's social life. "Dignity is worth more than beauty," Lucian said, his hand resting protectively on Nomi's shoulder. "And in my world, it is the only thing that earns a seat at the table." The golden glow of the chandeliers now felt like a spotlight on a crime scene. As Lucian led Nomi toward the grand arched exit, the life of the party didn't just fade, it evaporated. The music remained dead, and in its place was the mechanical, rhythmic sound of the wedding staff moving in. They worked with a clinical, terrifying efficiency, their faces masks of indifference as they began to strip the room of its finery. Portia stood in the center of the wreckage, a solitary figure in a sea of white lace that now looked like a shroud. She reached out, her hand trembling as she tried to catch the eye of a woman she had called a friend for a decade. The woman looked away, suddenly fascinated by the bubbles in her glass, and stepped behind a floral pillar. Portia turned to another, a man who had begged for her father's business just an hour ago. He pivoted on his heel, his back a wall of cold tuxedo wool. The social death was swifter than any physical blow. One by one, the guests began to slip away, their departures silent and hurried, as if the shame clinging to Portia were contagious. No one offered a hand. No one offered a coat to cover her trembling shoulders. They treated her like a ghost, an invisible stain on a night that was already being rewritten in the minds of the elite. Nearby, the hired photographers, the ones she had personally instructed to capture every perfect moment, didn't stop. They didn't turn their lenses away out of respect. Instead, the shutters clicked with a frantic, predatory speed. They captured the mascara running in jagged black lines down her cheeks. They captured the way her tiara sat crooked against her matted hair. They captured the naked, empty space on her ring finger where a legacy had once rested. The staff moved around her with brutal pragmatism. A waiter reached past her to snatch a half-empty champagne flute from the table. A decorator began unpinning the cascading lilies she had spent months selecting. They didn't apologize for bumping her hoop skirt. They didn't see a bride. They saw a chore that needed to be cleared away before the night was over. Portia looked into the lens of a nearby camera, her mouth hanging open in a silent, jagged sob. She had spent her entire life orchestrating the world's gaze, demanding that every eye be fixed on her beauty, her wealth, and her triumph. She had wanted to be the most talked-about woman in the city. She had wanted to be the center of a moment that no one would ever forget. As the flashes continued to go off, recording her ruin for the world to see, the irony tasted like ash in her mouth. She wanted attention. She got it. The heavy oak doors of the ballroom finally swung shut, muffling the sounds of the scavenging photographers and Portia's distant, fatting cries. Outside, the night air was crisp, carrying the scent of rain and freedom. Lucian Vane didn't let go of Nomi's hand until they reached the edge of the stone terrace. The world looked different from here, larger, quieter, and stripped of the suffocating pretension that had filled the gala. Lucian turned to Nomi, his silhouette framed by the moonlight. The hard lines of his face had softened, the predator replaced by a man who remembered what it was like to be invisible. In the high-stakes world of the Vane Empire, many believed that power was built on fear, on the ability to crush anyone who stood in the way. But as Lucian looked at the resilient woman standing beside him, he knew the truth that Portia Sterling would never understand. Power without empathy isn't strength. It is a dangerous, hollow, brittle thing that shatters at the first sign of a real storm. Portia had spent years building a throne out of other people's insecurities, forgetting that public humiliation is a boomerang. It always, eventually, finds its way back to the hand that threw it. Tonight was a reminder to every witness in that room. Beauty is a temporary currency, but character is a legacy that outlives every diamond and silk thread in the world. Nomi looked down at her stained apron, then up at Lucian. The shame that had weighed her down in the ballroom had evaporated, replaced by a quiet, dawning realization. She wasn't a victim anymore. She was the woman who had reminded a king of his own soul. "Thank you," she whispered, the words small but steady. Lucian gave a single, respectful nod. "No, Nomi, thank you for staying who you are." The fallout of the Vane Sterling wedding will be debated in the city's shadows for years to come. Some say Lucian was a hero. Others whisper that his vengeance was too cold. What do you think? If you were the boss in that moment, would you have canceled the wedding right then and there? Was Lucian too harsh for ruining her life in public, or was he exactly right to give her a taste of her own medicine? Subscribe if you believe that respect matters more than appearance.